Hi, everyone. Good evening. I think we're going to get started here. For those of you that have not met me, my name is Aaron Fulk. I'm the new Director of College Counseling here at Marin Academy. Gabrielle and I are super excited to have you all here. We know how busy your schedules are, and to take a precious few moments during the first week of your students' school year is really important for us, and we're going to be mindful of that and try to talk for about 45 minutes and then give 15 minutes or so of questions so we can have you all out of here at a decent hour. I'm going to take a second to do something that I hope I will never have to do again, but I'm going to talk just a little bit about myself to give you some background of where I'm coming from. I'm a native Southern Californian and then went to college out in Virginia at Washington and Lee University, where I majored in English literature and played football and baseball, among other things. I then worked in the admissions office at W&L for a few years. Welcome, come on in. Where my main function was recruiting underrepresented students to the school. I then moved to the Bay Area, where I got a master's in education policy at Stanford. The next year, I read applications for Stanford, as well as doing some other projects. And then I started my independent school career at a school down in Orange County called St. Margaret's Episcopal School. And then I went out to Richmond, Virginia at the Collegiate School, where I was the Associate Director of College Counseling before landing here at MA. I cannot tell you how amazing it's been so far with my time here in Marin. Your students are intelligent, inquisitive, thoughtful young adults, and I can't believe I get to spend my days, for lack of a better word, just hanging out with them. So it's been great so far. I'm going to turn it over quickly to our head of school, Travis, who's going to say just a couple words, I think, about the start of kind of the final year here at MA for your students and what that process might entail. Here you go, Travis.
One of these days I'm going to get a headset like Madonna, but just not this evening. So I wanted to say a few things tonight about this whole process called college. And it is definitely, of course, we're the teachers, so we're going to say it's an exciting journey. And it's one that your students are prepared for. And we also recognize that there's a tremendous amount of weight on this. So for those of you that have come to know me, I rarely give unsolicited advice. But I'm going to give some unsolicited advice tonight. And I hope, since I don't do that a lot, that you'll listen and take it on board. But the first thing I want to say, I want to tell a very quick story about my own family. So when I was in about the 10th grade, which meant my brother was in the 11th grade, my dad, we lived in Alexandria, Virginia. My dad got us all into the car to drive down to Charlottesville because he wanted to show us the University of Virginia. And my mom's dad had gone there, my dad had gone there, and this is a source of tremendous pride in our family. And he couldn't wait to show us the lawn and the this place and the that place. And I'm just going to say this was, let's just say, the mid-'70s. So I'm just saying that. So we arrived, and we go to walk down the lawn. I just have to tell you, I grew up with stories about the University of Virginia, right? And on the lawn, the precious lawn. Did anybody here go to UVA besides me? Okay, wahoo-wah. It is just like, it's like a mythical place. So spread out on 4 blankets were a bunch of guys with hair down to their waist, bare-chested, drinking Budweiser out of cans. Now, this is not the University of Virginia, okay, and this is not my moment to say apply or don't apply to the University of Virginia. But my point was that my father had this ideal concept of this place, and we walked right into a reality that was slightly different from what he had remembered, okay? So my only point about this is to say this, is that it's your kids that are applying to college, and colleges are not the same as when you went to them, even if your kid ends up going to the college that you went to. So I just think that's a really important moment, because, I mean, every single parent I ever talk to says, we don't put any pressure on our kids. We're not that parent. Every single one. I have never heard one person say, I'm putting pressure on my kid to go to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, whatever, University of Virginia. But the bottom line is that we do give subtle messages. I'm going to confess that I already gave a subtle message to my boys when they were 4. I went to a conference at the University of Virginia and brought them home T-shirts, which they now refer to as their Cavaliers. So we do this, and we do it in small ways and large ways. And I'm trying to be funny about it, but I just think it's important. 2 things. One, If you really want them to have an open experience, remember that in all your conversations. If you really don't want them to have an open experience, and there may be reasons for that. You know, my brother and I went to a state university. It was a great one, but that was because of what my parents could afford. So if, in fact, there are parameters around the college counseling piece for your family, be upfront and clear about it. You know, just be upfront and clear. That's one of my first suggestions. The second is this. We're going to say this to your children, and I want you to hear it loud and clear. They are not their college acceptances. They are not their college acceptances. And you know from how you felt, if your kids were applying to high school here, which they all had to do, that you had skin in the game, right? And they had skin in the game, and it felt like pressure. And we're glad they're all here. They may have originally wanted to go somewhere else. But the bottom line is that they are not their college acceptances. And think about it. They have far more choices about colleges than they do about independent high schools. And maybe that could just relieve a little bit of the pressure, for one thing. One last thing that I want to say that I think is really important, and that is this. Find time to talk. And you must think that is the most obvious thing I've ever heard. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean find time to talk does not mean talk to them constantly every day. Don't do that. They will hate you for it. Did I lose something? Oops, we have a loose wire. That's okay. Is find a time once a week that is the time in the week that you talk college. Find the time and plan it. And be disciplined with yourself and stick to it. The only other thing I would say is if you have a really hard conversation to have or you feel like you're not getting any information, make up a reason to go on a 2-hour car ride. Nobody can get out. You don't have to look at each other. And it'd be amazing how much information you get. And connected to that, I will say this. How many of you feel like there is a going to college buzz in independent schools? Like, where are you going to college? What's a good college? What's a good process? Where to apply, where not to apply? ED1, ED2, ED3. This is a moment to keep your own counsel. And we say this to our kids. Keep your own counsel. Don't participate in the buzz. Don't participate in it. It's only going to make you anxious, stressed out, you have no control, and half of it isn't true. Okay? And I say that from having watched this for 36 years. A quick word about Gabrielle and Aaron, who are an incredible team for your students and who are so excited to be working with them. They have spent time reading about them, getting to know them. Their college counseling workshops that happened at the beginning of the school year were phenomenal success. I want you to listen to them. I also want to say a few words just to be totally transparent. They are really available and engaged with your kids. They are not available 24/7. Okay? They're not. On Thanksgiving Day, don't expect them to get back to you. And we have families that do expect that. But I just want to be upfront about that. On Christmas, New Year's, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, it's not going to happen. Emergencies are when people are dying or near bleeding to death. Okay? It is not an emergency. There are very few college counseling emergencies. So part of what they may do is they may read their email and they may really decide, well, it's not really an emergency. They will get back to you within 24 hours. If you email them at 6:30 on Friday afternoon, you may not hear from them until Sunday or Monday. Okay? But I promise you that you are getting 100%, 110% investment from these folks. And they're going to have a lot of good advice. Also, one last word, and then I'm going to stop and turn it over to them. Sometimes, how many of your kids, I bet it's almost 50-50, who are completely engaged, they've already written their essays, and they're good to go, and another half, they're like, what? I have months before I have to do that. Anybody have those kids? I think I'm going to have those children. By the way, I invite you in 11 years to remind me of all the things I've said to you. Our boys are starting first grade, so I say this with a lot of humility. But I think it's really important that you understand that going to college, like we saw all the seniors out here at the circle, they were yelling and screaming and carrying on. It was really great. I think part of it, unconsciously, is that they see the end of their childhood coming. And sometimes kids step away from the process of college counseling at very moments. They may not be quite on the timeline you want them on because they feel anxiety about it. So find that one day a week, get in a long car ride. They're not their college acceptances. You are not their college acceptances. Keep your own counsel and have fun with the journey. Okay. You're welcome.
Thank you, Travis. So a little bit about what we're doing tonight. And the main goal is to get you up to speed. As you know, all of your students have participated in the college application workshops that we held during the month of August. So we want to share with you a lot of the information that we covered with them during that workshop, obviously a much more abbreviated version, as you can imagine, but a little bit of information on some of the things that we did cover with them, and your students hopefully have reported back to you on some of what they learned and some of what they accomplished during that day. But we went through with all of them the common application and some critical elements of the common application that we needed to have them fill out in a particular way. Also made sure that everything is complete, thus that all of their materials are going to match as they're submitting documents and that all of their documents can be submitted through Naviance successfully. So all of that's been taken care of. We also had a mini essay workshop with them, a mini UC application workshop with them, and really talked with them about our expectations for both them and for their counselors in this process and how we want to work together. So we expect them to be meeting with us regularly, keeping us up to date in terms of what they're thinking for college, both online through Naviance and, of course, in person, and to be working with us on their written materials, so all of their essays and so forth. So we got into a lot of great detail, and our main goal with the college application workshops was so that students weren't starting the year off already in a panic. And as I'm sure you've noticed, they're already stressed and already anxious. So we really wanted to bring that down a few notches by getting them going. And the main point is that no one is behind at this point. So we wanted to get them all started and get them moving on their application so they don't start off the year automatically thinking, oh my God, I'm so behind. I haven't done this. I haven't done that. I hear so-and-so's doing this and I haven't started this essay. So everyone has now at least started. You can confirm that your child has started their applications at this point. So that's the good news. And Aaron is going to share a little bit more about what we hope to accomplish as we move forward. And one thing I do want to point out before he does that, outside on the table, we did provide all of you with a timeline that we also provided to the students for their senior year. So this will help both the student and you make sure that they are on track and completing what they need to do as each month of this fall and this year goes by. So a couple of important dates that you can find in there include testing registration deadlines, upcoming events that we'll be holding both for parents and for students, things like the UC Cal State workshop that we'll be having in October. All of that is in there to help them stay on task, and we'll go over some of the other ways that we'll be helping them stay on top of things in just a little bit.
I'll just say, in a broad sense, a good timeline for our students in an ideal world would be, and I know, bear with me here, their applications would be completed before Thanksgiving break. Some of you with older kids are like, no way, this can't be possible. Before Thanksgiving break, and then we want many of them, it's not going to be for every student, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but to try to have some decisions back before the holiday break, as Gabrielle mentioned, to try to manage both scaffolding deadlines for them with application workloads, as well as trying to, with those of you with older students, you know, as soon as they're admitted to a college, there's so much less stress. Like, even though they attend Marin Academy, where 99 or 100% of our students are admitted to four-year universities, they for some reason don't believe us. Like, they're like, no college is going to admit me. And it's like, no, plenty of schools were going to admit you. So it's when they hear that first one, they just feel a lot more calm. As far as meetings, right now, Gabrielle and I, for the next few weeks, are going to be in a lot of structured meetings, right, where we're encouraging your sons or daughters to email us and set up appointments with us. And those meetings are going to be a little bit longer, probably like 20 to 40 minutes, where we're going through procedural things like the forms we'll share with you, as well as their list and revising their list and personal statements. But we also know it's important to have unstructured time as well. In my world, it'd be perfect if every student came by once every other week for 5 to 15 minutes. But not every student works for it, and our schedule isn't always that malleable. But we are trying to preserve tutorial times which there is every day now, to be drop-in times for your students. So hopefully between some mornings, some after school, and then tutorials, and then after this first month of school, we will have a lot more time for drop-in times as well as structured appointments. We also want to emphasize college rep visits. Those are going to start in a week and a half. Those are posted on the landing page in Naviance when you log in. They are all there. Naviance also automatically sends reminders to your sons or daughters if that school is listed in their colleges I'm applying to list or colleges I'm thinking about list. And our fantastic assistant Megan also sends weekly updates. So the gist here should be there should be no excuse about not knowing a school's here or who's coming when. They should know. And it's very important for seniors to be coming to these events. Some schools care deeply about demonstrated interest, and in those cases, they really need to make every effort to come, as well as these are the same people that are likely reading their actual applications, so it's always good to put a face with a name. So rep visits will be important, and they should be well aware of that at this point.
So before we get kind of into the meat of our topics tonight, we do want to share with you a couple of things that we got when we asked the students what type of advice they would like to share with their parents. So at the end of each workshop that we ran in August, we had all the students sit down with an index card, and we just kind of let them, we told them we were going to be talking to you all tonight, and we asked them to write on the card whatever advice they thought would be most important for us to share with them. So we've collected a good sample that we feel like we're pretty representative of the entire class and the feedback that we got. And we want to share those with you and talk a little bit about what we think that they mean. So I'm going to read the first set, and I'll post them up here as I read them. Please help me with time management. Also, let's have a regularly scheduled check-in so we only talk about college once a week. Another student said, "You're not the one applying to college. Please respectfully back off." Third student said, "Every conversation should not be about college. That being said, I will happily accept your help when I ask for it." Yeah, does this sound familiar to anyone? Travis actually touched on a lot of these points already, and I think the main idea behind these particular quotes is all about family engagement and how you all are interacting with your kids. And it's really important, as I'm sure you know, but to just keep in mind that they're already thinking about college probably way more than they should be. And so it's really important to them that they get a little bit of space in between when they're talking about it. So as one of the students so eloquently put, college can't be the topic of every conversation. It shouldn't be something that you talk about every night at dinner. It shouldn't be something that you're hounding them about while they're brushing their teeth, while they're on their way out the door to school or to practice. Setting a time up once a week or twice a week if you feel like that's better is really just the best way to make sure students are still feeling that independence and still feeling like they are in the lead in this process. And if you think back to what we talked about during junior college night, we really do want them to be in the driver's seat for this process. And we know they're not quite adults yet, but a lot of them think they are. And so let's at least give them that space to start doing the process on their own and help them more of in a role of support than as the driver. So we're, in the passenger seat, we're in the back, and we're supporting them and giving them advice. And I think they could really use that. And I think another thing to think about as you're having these conversations with your kids is that the conversations about college should really go beyond just the admission process. This is also the time to start thinking and talking about some of the more realistic aspects of being an adult and moving out and being on their own in college. Finances, that's a big part of it for them. If your student's going to need to get a job in college or if they're going to be on a budget, these are the things that you want to go ahead and start talking about now. I had a student last year whose response was actually like, "How do I make food?" That's what he wrote down on his card. So if you haven't taught your kids how to cook meals for themselves or to do laundry, I still remember to this day my senior year in college, one of my neighbors knocking on my door and asking to borrow a can opener. He had some soup that he wanted to heat up. I hand him the can opener, and he's looking at the can opener and the soup can, and it was clear that he did not know what was next. If your kids don't know some of these basic life skills, this is a good time to talk about those things. So bring some levity to the college conversation and talk to them a bit more about what not only is just in the college process, but what's beyond that. How should they be conducting themselves once they're on campus, and what are the important things that they need to know as an adult?
And I'm going to read a couple quotes having to do more so with boundaries, which may be a word that you've heard once or twice in this process. The first one, Gabrielle, can you throw it up there for me? Is don't act like there's a right way to do all of this or a right place to go. This is my process. So aside from the obvious that Gabrielle talked about, we want our students to have agency over this process. I would encourage you to also start thinking about the words you choose to use around college. A huge pet peeve of mine is when parents or students say, well, that's a good school or that's a bad school. Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. Right? Be specific when you say, like, what is it about that school that makes it good? Or what is it about that school that makes it a poor fit? And similarly, I can tell you that when I've done the workshops with many of your students, every once in a while, there's one that has a very adolescent, apathetic look on his or her, tends to be his face. And despite that look, you would be shocked at how perceptive your students actually are. And when you say something like, I don't think that's the right place for you, even though your intention is to give good feedback and input, right? Implicit in that is that there is a right place and that there is an expectation and pressure. And you would be shocked to know that your 17 and 8-year-olds actually do pick up on that, right? And they might perceive that differently than what your intention is. So just be more deliberate with vocabulary. Gabrielle, can you put the second one? I don't need to apply to that many schools. I'll just say this really quickly. I've worked with a lot of students now in my brief time, and I can assure you I have not once had a senior, at graduation come up to me and be like, hey, Aaron, I am so happy that I applied to 18 schools. I got to tell you, I thought 12 was enough, but thank God I applied to those other 6. I would have really not found myself. No one's going to say that, ever. Ever, 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 I promise you. And when Gabrielle and I go over the list of schools with your students, if we tell them, like, hey, that's a balanced list, we think that hits all the factors that are important to you, and I'll talk about this more in a second, then we mean that. And don't pressure them just to add more schools for the sake of adding more schools. And lastly, it's different and harder than when you applied, right? If this phrase leaves your mouth in the next 6 months, when I was in college, or when I applied to college, I would encourage you to maybe pump the brakes a little bit and think long and hard about whether you want to finish that clause. Because what can happen is, again, even though your intention is to just provide some kind of perspective, is your students might have just an inherent resentment. Because even though that might have worked for you 20 or 30 years ago, most of you look like 15, 20 years ago. Totally right. Yeah. That they're going to realize, like, hey, this is more complicated and more difficult now. Right? And so, again, it might have a different impact than what your intention is.
So the last set is more about the influence that you can have on your student based on what you're saying. So a couple of quotes that we collected. Remember to keep an open mind. Try not to share your critical judgments about colleges without me asking, because it puts a bias in my head. Please do not base the quality of a school or my potential success at a school on acceptance rates or reputation. And finally, I don't want to disappoint my parents. So I think these are really important quotes because they really show the effect that your words can have on your kids. And it can get really easy to get caught up in the college talk and about the different prestige of different colleges. And you'd be surprised how much they internalize some of that talk. And what it comes down to is they need to be reassured that the college acceptance that they may or may not get is not going to affect how their parents feel about them. And that's really important. So I think you have to keep in mind that what they need in this process is support, reassurance, and you need to be their rock during this process. There are going to be plenty of ups and downs. And I can tell you, Aaron and I, we volunteer to be the person that you call when you have questions. If you feel like you're getting to the point where you are harassing your kid a little too often with the college questions, come to us. Because it could very well be you call and you say, hey, I don't know that Mike is on top of things, and I just really don't think he's doing what he needs to do. We might say, you know what, we've gotten like 5 different supplement essays from him. He's exactly where he needs to be. Or we might say, you know what, you're right, I haven't seen Mike in like a month, and we really need to check in here. So we can definitely tell you from our end what we're seeing, and if we feel like the student's on task. What I've seen in the past is that sometimes students really just want to do this on their own, and they start to shut their parents out a little bit, but I'm still seeing them every other week. They're checking in. So sometimes they really are doing what they say they're doing, and they need a little bit of trust. So feel free to check in with us before you're checking in with them, and we can definitely give you a little bit of perspective. The quote that I do want to wrap up with, just to make you feel a little bit good. Tell them it's okay. I'm going to be fine, and I will return. I love you. They do love you, I promise. This is a difficult time, I'm sure, for most families, and you're going to get through it. It's all going to work out, and your kids still love you. So help them stay feeling that way and talk to us, and wait to do it once a week with your kids about college.
All thinking, did my kid write that? And the answer is yes. They all wrote that. Yeah.
So now we want to jump into talking about the components of the application, and we went through all of this in much more detail with your students so they know exactly what they need to be doing, but we want to also give you a sense of what's really important in this process. So this pretty much encompasses what students are going to be submitting in the application process and what they'll be evaluated on. So as you can see, the first thing that's listed there is their transcript. And as you can imagine, that is typically the most important element of their application, and that shows their academic history and their academic progress. So in workshop, we provided your students with their most updated transcript. Similarly to when we provided it to all of you in College Night for Juniors, it has all of their MA grades up to this point, so up through the end of junior year. And just as a reminder, if any of your students did a study away during junior year, if they did the mountain school or any of the other affiliated programs that we have in junior year, or if they've taken courses over the summer maybe at a college or anything like that, make sure that we just have those transcripts on file. We will submit them with the MA transcript on your students' behalf to their colleges. Just make sure that we have it. If there's any other programs that you may have done, that students may have done, feel free to send that to us and we can submit that as well. But you will find on the transcript the student's most updated unweighted GPA is what we report. It's also in Naviance. That's all been updated, so you can find that very easily. And that'll give students a sense of where they are now in the process. And again, as a reminder, the colleges are looking at the entire transcript. They are, of course, mostly looking at the upperclassmen years. Of course, that's the most indicative of what a student is going to be capable of in college, so that's important to keep in mind. One tidbit that we also shared with the students who are thinking about applying to UCs or Cal States is that they do recalculate their own GPA for students that is a weighted GPA, and they only use years 10 and 11. So that's just something to keep in mind. They do still look at the 9th grade year, but they only calculate a GPA for grades 10 and 11. So we've also provided students with the calculator for how to figure out what their weighted UC or Cal State GPA is. So you'll be able to access that if you are curious as to what it is. So in addition to the transcript, we also provide every college with a copy of our high school profile, which was also on the handout table outside. So this is something that's really important because it provides colleges with some context about what they're seeing on the transcript. So as admission counselors for Aaron and I, the transcript and the profile were the first things that we were going to open when we were reviewing a student's application. And so what you're looking for in the profile is to see what type of curriculum is available at that school and to see what type of programs that school offers. So for example, they're going to see that we don't have an international baccalaureate or IB program. They're going to see we don't offer an AP program here, that we only offer one. So they're not going to expect our students to have, 5 or 6 APs in their senior year. So that's really important information that we want to make sure that they have in this process so that they can review the transcripts effectively and have a good understanding of our curriculum and the type of rigor that our curriculum offers. Additionally, another really important step, particularly in terms of submitting, is testing. So we talked a lot about testing. I know students often have a lot of questions about whether or not they should continue testing, how to submit their testing, all of those really important questions. And testing, a couple of things that I definitely want to highlight are, most importantly, it is the student's responsibility. Oops, click the wrong button here. I want you guys to see this is exciting. Oh, it's not doing it.
My bad.
Oh, Aaron. I blame him for all the pressy things. It's going to zoom in where it says student in big red letters. It's a student's responsibility to submit their testing to all of their colleges and universities. And that's something we said to them at least 10 times during workshop. We will continue to say it and remind them often, because the most important about that is that they need to do it a few weeks ahead of their deadline. It's really important. It's not an instantaneous process. So it does take some time for the scores to be sent and for them to arrive and be processed at their colleges. So with that in mind, if your student is thinking about applying early action or early decision, and we'll talk a bit more in detail a little bit later on about how to come to that decision, but if they are, it's really important for them to make sure that they're taking their tests at the appropriate time this fall and that they're submitting them at the appropriate time. So most schools will accept, well, all of them will accept the October test date if they sit for that, but only some schools will accept the November test date if they are planning to apply early. So that'll be really important for them to check the requirements and see whether or not that is the case. In either case, if they're sitting for the October or for the November test, they need to request that their scores are going to be submitted to their schools before those scores are released. So I recommend that they do it before the day of the test, or even on the day of the test, they can request that their scores be sent to particular schools. If you wait for the scores to be released, they will most likely be late. So that's really critical. And we've said this to them a few times, and again, we will continue to remind them. But that's highly, highly important in terms of getting their testing submitted. That is often, if there is a moment of panic in the college process, Aaron and I have found that it's often the moment that they forgot to submit their testing, and we don't want anyone to have that panic moment this year. So, in other testing news to keep in mind, most schools do not require subject tests. However, it's really important that your student check to see if that's required. If they do require them, it's typically 2. And we've encouraged students to take some subject tests in the spring just so that they would be prepared and have some test results available to them if they end up selecting a school that requires them. If any of your students are looking at Georgetown, you may or may not know, but they require 3 because they are a special snowflake. So just make sure that that's on your radar. That's the only kind of unique situation. If your student has taken the ACT with writing, typically schools will not also require the 2 subject tests. So it can get pretty funky. It's just really important that your student is looking at the requirements for each and every school that they're looking at. And of course, Aaron and I are here to help them and remind them as well to be doing that. But those are some of the quirks about testing. Letters of recommendation, we also talked about in depth with your students. There are 3 letters of recommendation that are required for the college process. One comes from Aaron and I, and that's the counselor recommendation. And then there are 2 required from teachers. And what's important to remember is that these teachers need to come from the 5 core subjects that colleges and universities consider the most important. So while at MA we are a very arts-focused place and our arts program is extremely rigorous, for the purposes of colleges and universities, they're really focused on English, history, science, math, and world languages. So the 2 teacher recommendation letters that your children should be focused on getting should come from those 2 areas. They don't have to be, 1 teacher from humanities, 1 teacher from math science, unless your student is looking at some engineering programs. They do ask for that. But generally speaking, they can choose any 2 teachers from those 2 areas, and that's no problem. The most important part about recommendation letters, as you've probably already heard from your students, is the process that we have them complete in order to ask their teachers. So we do have what's called an asking period, and that started yesterday on the first day of school and ends on September 6th. And the idea behind this this asking period was to make sure that all students have the opportunity to ask the two teachers that they want, but to also be reflective about that process and to check in with Aaron and I and to talk out why they're thinking about asking certain teachers. So we want to make sure that they all have that time. So no teacher is actually going to answer your children at this point when they ask them. They're going to wait until after the asking period is over. What's also important for students to be doing during this asking period is that they need to have a one-on-one conversation in person with the two teachers that they're asking. So they should not be emailing their teachers to just ask them in an email. They shouldn't be approaching them at lunch or dropping into tutorial. We've told them that they can email to set up a time. That's no problem, but that they need to ask in person. They do need to be able to articulate some of the reasons why they're thinking that this is a good teacher to write their recommendation letter. And typically, we want them to think about teachers that they've had in their upperclassmen years of high school, or teachers that maybe they're going to have again from a sophomore or a freshman year, teachers that have seen their growth, that have seen them be challenged in a positive way, and that have seen them grow intellectually, and that where they've done their best work. Those are all important ideas for them to keep in mind when they're thinking about which teachers to ask. And Aaron and I, most of our meetings that we've had this week and that we'll be doing next week, a lot of that is going to be focused on who are you thinking about asking for your recommendation letter. So we'll be helping them through that process. A question that typically comes up about recommendation letters are supplemental recommendation letters. Can we ask anyone beyond the 3 required recommenders? My response to that question is always to first step back and think about all of the components in the application. We've got the application itself. We've got the main essay for the application, typically some supplemental essays for that application that are required, the transcript, the high school profile, the secondary school report that comes with Aaron and I's letter, and the 2 additional teacher recommendation letters that are required. We're talking about a lot of material that admission officers need to get through in typically 10 to 12 minutes tops. So if you're thinking about adding to that pile, this really needs to be something that's going to be very different than what's already in their application. So if your son or daughter is thinking about getting a letter from a former boss that they had, or a current boss, a mentor that they had at an internship, a coach, etc., think about what that letter might include. If they're just going to say, you know what, Johnny is a super hard worker and has a great work ethic, that's probably something that their counselor and their teachers are already going to be talking about. So it's really important that that additional letter has new and different information. What we also often get asked about are art supplements. And we're an artsy place, like we talk about, and we celebrate that. But most colleges are not going to be interested in an art supplement from your student unless they're applying to an arts major or an arts-focused program. And they'll be pretty specific about what type of art supplement they'll want for those programs. So it's usually only about 10% of our students that will submit an art supplement or that have any use for submitting an art supplement. So I know some students will feel pressured, 1, because they go to MA, or 2, because they're thinking, well, maybe if I just send any additional information, it could be helpful, but not every school is going to want that. A really good way to tell if a school is open to receiving a supplement like that is if they have SlideRoom in the Common App. Stanford's a good example. They have SlideRoom link in the Common application, and that typically means that they'll welcome that type of additional material. And Aaron and I can also help them decide whether or not that makes sense, but that's often a question that we get. A couple of other supplemental things. Interviews often come up. Have any of your students already done an interview? Show of hands. A lot of them started this summer. Great, a good number. Yeah, and some of the students we talked about during workshop had already done their interview, and one of the things we asked them to share with their peers were, how was it? And the main answer that we got that we wanted the other students to hear was, it was fine. It was casual. And we don't want them to be nervous about doing interviews. For most schools, they're not a required part of the process. They're simply an optional way for students to learn more about the university and for the university to learn more about them. And we would encourage them to take advantage of that opportunity if they have it. Not every school will offer interviews. The UCs, for example, don't offer them at all. Ivy League schools only offer them to a select group of students after they've applied, so it's kind of invitation only. So you don't need to necessarily panic about it, but if you see that there's an interview opportunity available and it's a school that your student is particularly interested in, I would encourage them to do it. What we reminded them of during workshop was that they've all already done at least one successful interview, and that was to get into MA. So we know that they're capable students, and of course they all present very well, so they have the skills to do it. The interviews are not designed to trip students up. They're really, again, a way just to get to know them better. So they only need to come prepared to talk about themselves. The one question I always highlight for students to think about in advance is, why are you interested in X university? That's a very, very common question, and they should be able to come up with a good response for that. And then I also encourage them to come up with questions of their own that they're going to want to ask whoever is conducting their interview. And that could be an admission representative, it could be a current student, or it could be an alumni member if they're doing a local interview. So a couple of different options there. And right now I want to show you, if I can. Oh, here it is. See?
It did it, Gabrielle.
Took a minute. I want to show you the form that the students will be submitting for their recommendation letter. So after a teacher confirms that they'll be able to write the letter for them, the students got in their folder for workshop 3 brightly colored forms. One is yellow, and Aaron's going to talk all about that one in a moment, but the 2 other ones are blue, and those are forms that they need to submit to their teacher by specific deadlines in order to help their teacher stay on top of when they need to get their letters completed. So if they're applying to any early decision, early action schools, they need to submit the blue form by October 5th, and if they are applying regular, then they have until December 1. That's the drop-dead deadline for their blue forms to be submitted. So this is really important because otherwise teachers may not know when their deadline is, and we don't want them to miss the deadline. So that's very important. And so if your student has lost these forms already, hopefully they have not, but if they have, we have many, many extra copies, and they can come to us to get another one. I do want to pause right now. I know that was a ton of information, and just see if there are any questions at this point. Yes, in the back. Yes, thanks for pointing that out. So UC Berkeley last year, for the first year ever, decided that they would ask some students to submit a letter of recommendation. So this is not everyone, and this is not something that they'll be doing before the application process. Once their application is submitted, this will typically start in December and January. They may or may not get an email from UC Berkeley asking them to submit one letter of recommendation, and it could be from a teacher or it could be from a counselor as well. Last year, I think we had maybe half of the students that applied to Berkeley overall were asked for a letter. We were trying to just keep track of that a little bit. And I even read for Berkeley last year, but however they decided to select which students were getting the letter was happening somewhere at a higher level. So I couldn't tell you exactly what the reasons were behind it. But my understanding is really that it's to provide some additional information, and they don't have the bandwidth right now to get that from everyone. And this is still very new. So we're not yet clear on how that's going to proceed in the future. But from what I can tell, it's not a good or a bad thing. It seems to be neutral. We had some students that did very well in the process that were asked, and others that did well that were not asked. So we'll see what that means. But thank you for asking about that. Right here in the front. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Aaron, you want to tackle that?
Yeah, it's if your student's interested in, it's really for Division I schools for sports, you have to register with the NCAA clearinghouse, and you can do that all the way through basically January, and then it's also the same site that we would submit the final transcript. But basically, we treat that as almost like a separate college internally for our office. Like, we send all that stuff as soon as the student does need to register and then does need to send scores to the NCAA clearinghouse. It's almost best just to think of it as like a college, right? Like, you're sending scores, we're sending transcripts there, and we're happy to talk through that with any of you who maybe are going through the Division I process.
Yeah. So the question was about a student that just recently decided that they were going to go for Division I athletics.
One more, maybe?
Yeah, right here. Yes. So for most students, the junior year is probably going to work out best for them. But for other students, the sophomore year teachers could be a possibility, especially if they're going to repeat that teacher in senior year. Or even if they had them freshman year and they're going to have them again in senior year, those would be totally fine people to target for a recommendation as well. If they're going to have them again senior year, yes. Yes. So we're going to move on now, and I promise you we're going to leave plenty of time for more questions, so just so we get through all the information and not have to keep you all here all night.
I have to tell you all, when I was in college, I thought I would be an attorney, and I was like, that seems like a lot of minutia that I don't know if I want to worry about. And then I became a college counselor, and now I feel like a tax attorney with all the different decisions and deadlines that Travis alluded to. So that we're all on the same page, I'll walk through a few of these. The big one that Travis loves, you can tell, early decision, ED. That comes up the most. And again, that deadline is usually between November 1 and the end of November. Students hear back in mid-December at some point. And if a student applies early decision to a school and they are admitted, it means they will go to that college or university. It is binding, right? It's not, oh, I think I'll go or I should go. They are going. And the two questions we get around that is, one, is it advantageous to apply early decision? And Gabrielle and I are going to be really open and honest with your students that overwhelmingly it is highly beneficial to apply early decision to a school. And if you compare admit rates between regular decision and ED, oftentimes the ED admit rates are going to be 2 or even 3 times higher. That's just the reality. With that said, while we're going to be open with that data, it does not mean a student should just flippantly apply to a school, right? It is a huge decision. And the second question, which is related to that, is, well, do I really have to go? Like, what are they going to do? That's always like a great contrarian question from your sons and daughters. And I've told them that some schools, including one of the ones that I worked at, would exchange ED lists with other cross-app schools, right? And so they would see if they applied to more than one school ED, you can make a good bet that they're probably not going to be admitted. And then if a student was admitted ED and then decided not to attend, they would often share that name as well. Right? So that doesn't happen a lot. It's not often, but it does happen. And we prefer not to use like scare tactics with your children. What I prefer to tell them is that they are about to start making adult decisions. Those decisions have consequences. And what we care more about is our reputation as a school at Marin Academy, and kind of selfishly, our reputation in our office. And Gabrielle and I have worked very long and hard to cultivate relationships with admission reps all over the country, and they trust us because they know we're going to advise your students ethically. Right? And if 3 MA students applied ED to a college and then decided not to go, that college is not going to admit MA students early decision in the future. So we're trying to impress upon them the importance of being good stewards for Marin Academy and our community as a whole. So that's ED. ED2 is the same exact thing. It is binding. That deadline is usually between January 1 and February 1. Students will typically hear back in 3 weeks. And again, if you are admitted, you are going to that school. That's usually a good decision if your child's just totally undecided until December, and then they realize their first choice school has ED2. Great, you should use it. The other way is if they have a clear-cut number 1, and then they don't get in, they're deferred or denied or waitlisted, or and then they have a clear-cut number 2 school, then early decision 2 would be a great choice to use. Another fun deadline, I love that Travis said ED3. That's really sticking in my head, Travis. But REA, Restricted Early Action, for most students in MA, the schools that use REA is Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. If you ever want to hear me go off on a diatribe of epic proportion, you can talk to me after this, and I'll explain why they do that. But that decision means that you can apply to one of those schools, early action. It is not binding. You just apply early. You hear back early. But you can only apply to one private school, early action. And you can apply to any publics you want. UCs, Cal States, maybe the University of Virginia, I guess, UT Austin, Michigan, any public. That can be a little confusing. Is that clear? So you can only apply to like Stanford Early Action, for instance, and then any public school. And then the other one is a priority deadline. There are many versions of priority deadlines. They're typically highly specialized programs for arts or for scholarships. It's typically December 1st. But what I want to try to emphasize for all of you is that there are literally thousands of deadlines, right? All these schools have different deadlines, and priority deadlines can be very specific. And while Gabrielle and I like to think we know the vast majority of them, it is imperative for your students to know, especially if they're interested in specialized programs, if that school has a separate deadline. Does that make sense? Cool. Did I miss anything on Gabrielle on that? All right, next slide. So I'm going to talk quickly about College List. I think there's a misperception here at MA for the number of schools that a student tends to apply to. So I don't know how many you would all guess, but the average number of apps submitted for an MA student grad last year was 8. Most of our students think it's 10, 12, heaven forbid more. It is 8 schools. And we think a good range of schools is 8 to 10 schools. Some students might apply to 6 or 7, and that might be fine. Some might apply to 11 or 12, and that's okay. But 8 to 10 is the sweet spot. As I alluded to earlier, I have never worked with a student who has applied to more than 12 schools who has not experienced significant stress and anxiety in the fall of their senior year. And I don't know about you, but I can remember the fall of my senior year of high school, I wasn't remembering all the applications I was doing, right? I was thinking about the friends I was having, maybe getting sleep, something crazy like that. So 8 to 10 we find works. And within that range, we think that's a good number of schools to have likely, targets, and reach. And just so I can explain this to everybody, to us, a likely school is all things remaining consistent over the past few years. It is highly probable your student will be admitted to that school. It is not called certainty. It's called a likely. And every once in a while, there's a handful of colleges that will be a statistical aberration for that year, where their applications might go up by 50 or 70%, right? That's, again, uncommon, but it happens. And if that happens, then that likely school might not be a likely school anymore, right? A target is a little bit more of even for us, where we think, hey, you're going to be strong. It's kind of like 60-40 looking good. And I should say that Gabrielle and I are always going to be conservative when we give these ratings, because ultimately we want your students to have choice. Right, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Finally, reach schools. Reach schools can mean a variety of things. Right? A slight reach might mean, hey, every year we have a student from MA with your exact profile who is admitted to that school, but it is not the typical result. Right? The typical result might be waitlist or deny, but it happens. A solid reach might be one time in 4 years we've had a student with your profile admitted to that school. And then there might be a big reach where we will tell your student, we have never had a student with your GPA and test scores admitted to that school. Now, I want to be very clear here. That does not mean that we don't want your student to apply to that school, right? We are always going to be supportive of your sons and daughters. And if their dream school is a big reach school, fantastic. We're going to work with them to try to have the most compelling application that they can have to that school. But it does us no good to lie to them and tell them, oh, yeah, it's looking okay. Well, don't look at that graph. And then in the spring, they're devastated. We have to walk a fine line between being supportive of your students and managing expectations, right? And that's why we use these terms. And I think you can zoom in on the next one, Gabrielle. It's very similar to the teacher rec form, but they have to complete a form so that then we officially add the colleges to their colleges I'm applying to list in Naviance. You will see your signature is required, you'll be happy to know, so that you know where your child is applying to school. You will notice also that there are 10 slots on that first page, and that is not a coincidence. So if they want to apply to more than 10, again, Gabrielle and I are never going to say, like, you can't apply to a school. That's not our job. But we are going to start asking them more questions, right, if they're starting to get to more than 12. Like, do you really feel like you need to apply to both of these schools? Or what's the value add of having that school on there versus this other one? But they can apply to more than 10. They just have to fill out multiple forms. And on the back are a couple important questions we always point out to the students. Which 2 or 3 schools are your favorites? It's just good for us to track. Are they getting into their favorite schools? I also, sidebar, their dream school can be a likely school. That is a misnomer. If their student wants to be our best friend, their dream school will be a likely school. We will love them. So which colleges do you think they are likely to be admitted? And that's just so we can all be on the same page, right? It's not where the student thinks it's a likely. It's where we think it is a likely, right? And why it's so important that they have 2 or 3 schools that are likely schools so that they have choices. Did I miss anything on that form, Gabrielle? Great.
So just a little bit more information before we take a moment to take some more questions, but a couple of other things that we talk with students about. If you have not yet had the conversation about money with your student, this is the time to have it. If that's going to be a factor for your college application process, we definitely want to be having those conversations now. Whether it's merit aid or financial aid that you're thinking about, really important for students to know what the expectations are surrounding that. A couple of things that we recommend For merit money, if you're looking for outside scholarship opportunities, we typically recommend a website called fastweb.com. It's a database. Students can enter in their GPA, other interest information, and it'll funnel out a bunch of scholarships that might be applicable for them. But the caveat to this is that this is small dollar signs. We're talking $500 to $5,000 maximum. And while that can have a huge impact for things like transportation and books, if you're looking for more significant merit money, you're typically going to need to get that directly from the institution itself. And those are usually going to be the schools that are considered likely for your students. That's where they're most likely to get merit aid. So that's really important to think about. Financial aid is, of course, a completely separate process where students will need to fill out both the FAFSA, the federal form, as well as the CSS profile, which many private colleges will require. And we are holding a financial aid night in September 28th, and we'll have the former director of financial aid from Stanford, Marin Morrison, will be our speaker, and will be able to give some really important information about how to approach the financial aid process. But I always recommend that if financial aid is a big factor for your family, just start using the net price calculators. Every college has one on either their admission or financial aid website, and it's a great way to get a quick estimate of what your financial aid package might look like. So that's a really good way to figure out, is this a school that's feasible for our family, or is this a school that we should no longer consider? Erin and I are, of course, really happy to assist in any way we can in that process. And again, we'll have Marin Morrison on campus, who is definitely an expert in that area. So want to get that on your radar. The other thing that you'll notice, if you haven't already, is we have started to send out newsletters. You guys hopefully all received the August newsletter. Everybody, yeah? Awesome. Okay. So we'll be sending that out every month with important updates about upcoming events, tips and reminders for your student that you can help remind them about,